Well, now that the British public have been at the polling booths all day deciding on the future, who is going to lead the United Kingdom into the future, we'll now have to await the results. Lots of people will be up all night watching coverage, speculating endlessly. It will take many, many hours until we really know who is the next Prime Minister. So until that time, let's have a bit of fun, shall we? A bit of light relief and some political analysis with our excellent panel here in the studio in London for our special coverage. I'd like to welcome to the studio Paula Rhone Adrien, lawyer and commentator, Conservative peer Lord Marland, and political commentator Esther Krakue. Thank you, all three of you, for being here. And I'm going to put you on the spot, Lord Marland, and start...
I thought it should be ladies first, surely.
Well, you know what? As you're a Conservative peer, and we could well be seeing the Conservative government about to be in for a historic wipeout, and I'm sorry to say that, but that is the way the polls have been pointing. How would you describe their performance?
Well, firstly, I never believe the polls.
Go on, why?
So, well, they've got it wrong so often, and they got it horrendously wrong recently, of course, in India. So I never believe the polls, so we'll see what the outcome is. I think Rishi Sunak's done a very good job, actually. He had a very bad and difficult set of cards to play with. He's turned the economy around, he's got cost of living down, and he's tried his very best on the immigration issues, despite the weight of Labour and the legal profession trying to stop him doing things, and indeed the civil service. I think if you look back at the time that he's had, there has been this disconnect between the civil service and the ministers, which has got worse rather than better. Galvanising the civil service into work has been a real problem for the government, as we've seen. And if they're not working for you, having been a minister myself, it's very difficult to get them going. So I think that's been something very difficult for him. Clearly the government is tired. There are a lot of ministers there who've been in work for a very long time, and being a minister is an incredibly tiring job. It's terrible. It's crisis management day after day after day, and it is exhausting. And they look very tired, and a lot of them have decided not to stand again because they are tired. So I think it is a tired government, but I think Rishi's done incredibly well trying to get the thing back on track.
Paula, do you think that's a fair assessment?
Absolutely not. And of course, I don't feel at all sorry for any of Rishi Sunak's government, anybody that he worked for, Rishi Sunak himself. The people who I feel sorry for are the people who had to pull their teeth out because they can't get an NHS dentist. The people I feel sorry for are the people whose children who are suffering with their mental health and cannot access the help that they need so desperately. The people I feel sorry for are the nurses, are the junior doctors, are the consultants, are the paediatricians, are the GPs, are the paramedics. Those are the people who I've been feeling sorry for, the people who are working but are having to still claim benefits because they cannot afford to feed their children.
But the question wasn't about whether I felt sorry for I do feel sorry for those people. The question was, what did I think about Rishi Sunak's government, not about the people I feel sorry for. Of course, we all feel very sorry for those people.
Well, what I think about Rishi Sunak's government, it's the disunited kingdom. That's what Rishi Sunak's government has done. We are no longer a united country. We seem to focus on the differences between us instead of trying to work together, to understand each other, to come together. And that's what has really concerned me about this government.
Let's bring in Esther, because I think it's fair to call you a Conservative commentator. You've generally sided with the Conservatives in the past. Do you still feel that way?
I think this is the thing, because I identify as a small C Conservative. However, I'm a regular critic of the Conservative Party because they are not in any way, shape or form Conservative. I do think there's a fair point to be made about the lack of neutrality with the civil service, and I think that's one of the legacies of the Blair era, which actually basically didn't penalise civil servants from not being politically neutral. I actually know many senior civil servants who spoke about the joy of working under Blair and all of that, and they just couldn't make things work with the Conservative government. But the question I had for them was, this is your job. You know, you're supposed to not really care who's in power. Your job is to be a civil servant and to make the state tick. And I think it was from the attitude of those senior civil servants that I actually recognised there was an issue there. That being said, that does not negate I would say, the lack of competence of many senior Tory politicians. And I think that mainly has to do with the leadership of the party and what the party actually stands for. And yes, Paul is right. The country has had to suffer for it because, yes, we can criticise the politicians at the top at the end of the day, but the people who are really bearing the brunt of that are the people who are finding it difficult to feed their children, or people that are wondering what happened to Brexit, what happened to the free trade deals, why am I dealing with more regulations in certain industries than even before Brexit, when the whole point of it was to decide our future and become Singapore in terms or what a take you had on Brexit. So there's a lot of sort of lack of forward thinking across the board.
You mentioned leadership there, Esther. Let's think about then leaders, because a lot of people bring up the name Boris Johnson, despite the fact that he left in some disgrace from number 10 Downing Street. He was essentially ousted after the COVID Partygate investigations. But the Conservative Party actually sort of, I think I could say, wheeled him out in the final days.
Dug him up and stunned him back to life.
Pressed the Boris button at the last moment, and he came out and campaigned for Sunak. Lord Marland, do you think it was a bit late in the day?
No, I don't think that's totally fair that it was late in the day, because he had been doing quite a lot of social media and supporting a lot of candidates in seats. So he has been out there. You know, there clearly was tension between Sunak and Johnson, and Sunak didn't reach out to Boris in the way that perhaps encouraged Boris as much as he could have done. But also, you know, Boris is not universally popular for the reasons which I mean, people feel incredibly angry about him for the parties and some of the things like that. So he's not necessarily the greatest asset that you would want, and so I can understand that. In that he wasn't called back, but he is very, very popular, as you say, with a certain sector.
Well, we've been focusing quite a lot in our coverage over the last 48 hours or so about popularity and populism, and what does populism look like in the UK. Another very popular figure for some is Nigel Farage. Paula, can you see why?
Yes, and what I see is the failure of Brexit. Ultimately, what I see is the failure of those who would consider themselves working class to feel that they somehow benefited over the last 14 years. We heard, of course, about the VIP lanes during COVID, and yet there were, as I've said already, people who can't find an NHS dentist, can't get to see their GP. And so I can completely understand how Nigel Farage, who is essentially selling us snake oil, he's able to tap into the emotions of how sad, bad, angry, frustrated a lot of the voters are feeling, and he can sell them the world without having to promise them a delivery in terms of that.
Could he deliver, Esther, Nigel Farage?
This is the interesting thing, because now it's not just about him. I mean, he is obviously the face of reform, but he's trying to work with this kind of machine that's very new, has no infrastructure in place. And in many ways, I compare him to Marine Le Pen. The reason, even though their politics are slightly different, I think she leans more very left on economically speaking, and Nigel Farage, even though we didn't know much of his politics outside of get us out of the EU, has now kind of posited himself in the firm, like sort of liberal economic sense, right-wing, socially conservative. The question is whether he is dealing with a serious machine, a serious political machine. If he doesn't even win a seat in Clacton, first of all, we're not going to be speaking about him anymore. But if he's going to gain the same sort of populist momentum that Marine Le Pen has, there are many questions. The man is in his 60s, which by American standards is not old. It's actually a toddler. But this exactly.
60s.
He's not going. He cannot be the same force that he wants to be in 10 years' time. You have to pass the baton to someone who is a young sort of person of his ilk in British politics now that could possibly succeed him. We know that Marine Le Pen has managed to secure someone like that. There's no one on the horizon for that in Britain. And we know that it takes a long time to develop a reputation and to become someone that's not been tainted in the public image. So there are many questions as to whether Nigel Farage is actually running a serious political machine here. But Paula said, I understand his appeal.
Yeah, or is he just trying to get himself back in the good books with
I was going to ask Lord Marland that. Do you think we could see Farage coalescing with the Conservative Party once again?
Well, there's always been an anti-Farage leadership of the Conservative Party. None of them have wanted to work with Farage. I think it's been a mistake, actually. We should have done a deal with Nigel about a year ago and offered him... He was clearly flirting with the party. He was
flirting with Priti Patel, wasn't he?
Yeah, which was hard to watch.
not just pretty, but he was flirting with the party, and the party didn't take the opportunity to embrace him. And my sense has always been that if you are fighting a very tough election or a very tough battle, you really want to get all the side of the right flank on your side in order to do it. And I think they've missed a great opportunity there.
And I think
it's a controversial thing to say, by the way, amongst Conservatives, but I think so. He is an incredibly charismatic character. He is one of the major standout politicians of the last 20, 30 years. He's got that X factor. He does connect with people. I don't agree he's a snake oil salesman, but I think he's a formidable political figure and can't be ignored and won't be ignored. So I think that was a mistake. As to the future, well, it rather depends what the result turns out to be. I think he's going to find it very, very difficult being in Parliament. If he ends up with 5, 6, 7, 10 fellow Reform members, you're in opposition for 4 or 5 years, not really being able to make any headway because of the parliamentary process. And being in opposition, I was in opposition in the House of Lords for a couple of years, is not much fun.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about who have been the opposition. Labour, who could be set to take government on Friday. We don't know yet. We'll have to wait the results. If they do, certain quarters of the UK are calling this Starmergeddon. That's the right-hand side of things because of the leader, Keir Starmer. Paula, do you think that's a fair analysis of what Labour is going to be like in this country? Will they be able to achieve much?
I would prefer to reference his of Sir Keir Sparkles. You might remember when he had his party conference and glitter was thrown all over him. And
he was actually very composed then. That was one of those moments where I was like, it helps to be boring because he didn't make a fuss.
He
and I was quite surprised.
To that
I was surprised by that. Actually.
Because technically speaking, in terms of what some of our MPs have faced in regards to, threats, etc., and on their life, it was for a split second. It would have been a very scary moment for him. And whilst I put light on calling him Sir Keir Sparkles, what I'm hoping is actually that the areas of our hopefully united country will come together and see that he can be a positive force, a force for good, as for one of separating and dividing.
Esther.
I mean, I think it's interesting because we've just been speaking about reform, and actually I think the biggest threat to Labour are actually reform, because and this is assuming the polls are right, in areas where reform is posing the biggest threat, it's actually not in Tory-held seats. It's actually in red wall, traditionally Labour voting seats. And I think if, again, there's many ifs here, if Nigel Farage can get some sort of foothold in Parliament, he will be the biggest threat to Keir Starmer. Because while he will likely have a supermajority and it will take many MPs to peel off any significant support of Keir Starmer, the sentiment around the blue wall seats that the Labour Party will win back will quickly sour. Because just like George Galloway, Nigel Farage will have a certain type of appeal, not necessarily economically, but in terms of social conservatism, in terms of British nationalism, in terms of even harking back to Brexit, which is now a poison chalice, but saying, actually, I pushed this, but it didn't go the way that I wanted. Give us a chance.
And I don't have a problem with that per se in terms of meeting that unhappy voice head on. And I think it's important, isn't it, for democracy to ensure that those unhappy voices are heard. What concerns me with this kind of, Starmergeddon-esque is what we then also see is the racism and the negativity and the homophobia that we have seen in the recent weeks. That's what concerns me.
Another essence behind Starmergeddon, Lord Marland, some suggest that Labour are waiting to take power and then they're suddenly going to become a socialist, as some would call it, threat within the United Kingdom, that they're sort of characterising themselves as being centrist, but once they're in power, they're going to put forward some really progressive policy points. Do you think that's fair?
Well, there's nothing wrong with progressive policy points, but rather on the similar theme as you two have enunciated, I think it would be a big mistake to have a class war, a really big mistake. This country needs pulling together. It's all very well running in Clacton, where there is a point of view, but this country is a very complex, multicultural society now, and it's totally different across the piece. And so the incoming government has got to really steady the ship. It's got to not have a class war by attacking school fees or stopping hunting I mean, Tony Blair always regrets taking on the countryside with the hunting bill. No one needs this. What we need to do is get the productivity back into the country, get the country working again. Increasing productivity means that you can actually spend more money on social services and etc. At the moment, we're spending more than we earn. we're taxed the highest we've been taxed since the war, and we're almost at breaking point of tax. And if you attack the people who are creating the wealth, we're going to Dubai, you know, or we're going to some other country, and the brain drain happens as it did under Labour in the 70s.
It's already happening.
Yes.
Yeah, and it is already happening, but it will be the middle classes, of which I am happily one, will be thinking, where do we go? Where can we get our employment? And because I'm not going to carry on in this country with the social issues you've been talking about very correctly, and also the tax burden and the inevitable costs and the regulation. I mean, the regulation is absolutely ridiculous. Yeah. It's just stifling any form of growth. So if they've got any sense, they'll think about that, and then when they've redressed the balance sheet, it'll be fine. If they don't, then it'll be a short-term.
Unfortunately, we have to leave things there, but before we wrap up this conversation, I want to put you on the spot one more time and ask you your predictions for what you think is going to happen when we get the votes in. Who do you think is going to be the winner in this, Esther?
Of course, the Labour Party. I do think they're going to have something of a supermajority, but I also think that Keir Starmer will have a problem with that, actually. Even though a supermajority sounds like the ideal situation, you could have very powerful factions within that could pose problems for him and divide the country more than unite it.
Lord Marland, your prediction?
Well, I think it's hard to predict, but I've said from the beginning, so I'm not going to change it now, that I think the Conservatives will get 150 seats upwards. I could be totally wrong, of course, and but you know, I've said it, so I've said it. We'll
check tomorrow. We'll check it against your prediction. And Paula, what's your prediction?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking 150 seats. That's what I've said previously.
You really are clever.
Excellent tips.
The winner is going to be one of three people: Suella Braverman, Priti Patel, or Kemi Badenoch.
Taking the party, the Conservative Party, into the future, you think? Female-led. Interesting.
Yeah.
We shall have to invite you all back if you're correct, and congratulate you all. Look, we appreciate your time. Esther, Lord Marland, Paula, thank you.
Thanks for having us.